Frontline Gaming presents 40K Stat Center with your host, Val Heffelfinger and the Falcon.
LVO, more like LV. Whoa. We break down our first-hand foray into forging a narrative at the Las Vegas Open.
And then we canvass the caverns of Canberra to bring you the best from CanCon, the second best event that happened that week.
They played Warhammer in the 5th round. They played Warhammer in the 6th round. At Beachhead Brawl, they never surrendered.
And then we enter the seats where the elite meet to treat in the City of Wheat for the Wheat City Open.
Finally, we top it off somewhere in there when we'll mention your little tournament that could. This is 40K Stat Center. Oh, Pete, you wrote that into the script this week, and I really like that. I don't know why we haven't been doing that.
I just assume it was because we figured our listeners knew who we were, but I've begun to think we're wrong.
No, much like www.dickpills.com, you can't say it enough. You want to get it at least 3 times in there.
It's very true. Yeah, this is 40K Stat Center.
Aloha and welcome to episode 29-ish of the best competitive 40K podcast in the world. We've finally broken out of the general malaise that comes when old men spend too much time carrying cameras and counting Thunderfire cannons to bring you all the coverage from our beautiful World of War.
That's right, Kimosabi. We needed that extra week to recuperate and generally get over all that con crud that you inevitably get when, if you're like me, you spend a full 5 days in Las Vegas shaking people's hands, hugging them, in some cases full-on mouth-kissing them. I'm surprised I didn't end up with something far worse than what I got.
Even just from amongst our merry band of streamers, and for those that you haven't somehow already watched and memorized and committed to memory all of the various mishaps I made switching from camera to camera and the great coverage that was done on twitch.tv/40K Stat Center, spelled the Canadian way. It was a fantastic little run. It was great to do. And like any, high school musical or, maybe regional sports team championship, I really felt like really, really tight with you guys. I kind of wish we had yearbooks that we could have written like "Have a great summer" in at the end.
Aww. I don't think I could say it any better. Like, I had such a great time with, you and Panda Pants Tony, Adam, the Dromedary Camilleri, the Paul Murphy, I used to say that I was the handsomest man in competitive 40K. Paul is definitely the handsomest in casually competitive 40K for sure. That guy really rocks a suit pretty hard. I was quite impressed. Like, the best dressed by far of all of us.
He's one of those. He's like a Magic Eye a poster. Horribly dating myself to the mid-90s, but if you kind of go cross-eyed and let your eyes unfocus, he's actually quite handsome.
Yeah. And the fact that he left us with a quart of whiskey at the end of it all because he just forgot he had it.
Yes.
Also a great thing to have. Really though, I just loved it. I loved everything we did. I thought we mostly nailed it. We stuck the landing. We had a pretty rough opening. A couple times I forgot there was more than one mute button on the camera I was carrying, which led to some pretty interesting moments. And
I flew drones for like 10 minutes at a time with just like the mic on the drone, just drowning everybody out. So, whatever. It happens.
Yeah, in retrospect, we were terrible, for just very brief periods.
I don't think I did a single transition on day 1 or 2 without screwing it up horribly. So it's fine. But
it's fine.
I think it was still, groundbreaking for what we were trying to do. And that's the way I'm going to frame it forever.
Yeah. And we did the best coverage of the LVO that's ever been done.
Certainly yes, ever. 100%.
Yeah.
And will ever be done.
Will ever? I don't know.
Ever.
I want to do it again.
Oh, shit. Okay.
I don't know about you. I know there's stuff coming up in your life, but we're doing it again.
Well, all right. And also you guys are pretty much planning to cover every major event happening between now and forever. So I'm glad to see the enthusiasm is overwhelming.
If Adam Camilleri has his way, he's going to just live the ITC circuit, I think, and just commentate across all of it. It is unfortunate.
And talk about Warhammer.
If we could get paid more than nothing to do this.
More than nothing. That's a dream.
That is the dream. We are talking a lot about BAO. That looks like it is probably going to happen with at least, 80% of the team. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about that. I'm going to be in San Francisco either way. Hopefully I'll be able to do the thing I love to do while I'm there.
Yeah, which is linger around Warhammer tournaments and talk about people doing stuff. And I think it's actually a perfect match for your skill set. So let's maybe segue seamlessly, because I mean, we are talking about something that happened a month ago already. Is that possible? No, like 3 weeks.
No, 3 weeks, guys.
3 weeks, guys. Come on.
Holy,
it's not that long. And I mean, we did have quite the delicious, although we did 2 episodes, a little break in December. So we haven't been recording all that frequently. And also, it's been a little while since the LVO actually happened, but there's something that I think has gone a little overlooked during all of the LVO discourse, and I'm going to hit you with a little bump.
Crack open those spreadsheets, nerds.
Nerds.
Because it's time to put the stats in Stats Center. Courtesy of 40kstats.com.
That's your website, Pete.
That's me.
Before I was interrupted by Keith, I wanted to sort of prompt you on a topic, which is, we had this overwhelmingly powerful list here, the Broviathan, if you will, and it went something like, I don't know, was it 37-4 or some nonsense?
Yeah, it had like an 87% win rate. Yeah, it did okay.
It was pretty good, and that's all right. So what I wanted to return to was actually sort of some metrics that we looked at a little bit last year, but we hadn't really touched this year yet, and that is actually, how good are the good players that showed up at LVO? So did you do any crunching of numbers around, the top 100 ITC players and how they performed relative to regular schmoes like you and I?
Yeah, sure. So last year I got asked by, I believe it was Mr. Steve Pamprine, if I had any data on how like the top 100, 150 or so ITC players had performed at the LVO. And you had made a similar request, so I'd kind of already calculated all that data. Last year, that top 100, they had I believe it was a 78% win rate against the rest of the masses at LVO. So a lot of people thought that was pretty significant. I did the same this year. Of the top 100 ITC players that went into the LVO, there were 78. And they ended up having a 76.56% win rate. When I include their matches against each other, when I remove that weighting, because those are always going to be 50-50, it was an 86, almost flat 86% win rate against the rest of the masses, quote unquote, at LVO.
So pros v Joes, top 100, I'm sorry, was that 86% win rate?
Yeah, they beat everybody real bad.
So that's the top 100. So that's not just the Broviathan. I mean, that's a lot of Marines in there. Do we have anything on perhaps what the top 100 actually fielded? What did their meta look like?
Sure, yeah. Of the top 78,
sure.
They were whatever.
The big
33
100.
of them ran Space Marines, so over 40% brought Marines. Then you had 9 people bring Craft World Eldar. 8 brought Chaos Space Marines. There were 6 Orcs, 4 AdMech, 3 Tau, and then 1 or 2 of basically everything else, other than like a couple of the really bottom performers that you just don't expect to see people bringing right now: Space Wolves, Dark Angels, etc.
Basically, folks trying to get those coveted Best in Faction plaques, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of these top 78 or top 100 players that are really faction focused, and so they may think they're very good players. They go to a lot of events, but they're really they're aiming for best Necrons or best Blood Angels or whatever at the event versus aiming for taking it all or whatnot. So you see there was one of them playing Necrons. I believe that was Antonio Cedeno going in.
Yep.
And he ended up going 4-2. Got passed by Eula Sanders for best Necrons. There was like one Drukhari player, a couple Thousand Suns players, things like that. And these guys, they're all vying really more for best in faction, I think, at this point. A couple of them, like Chaos Space Marines, Eldar, you can tell they're there to win it. Yeah. Because Craft World and CSM did have lists that I think people thought going in had a chance if all the right criteria were met. But it's very clear, and it's always been this way, that the top players will steer towards lists that are going to win them at all. Yeah. And so that's why, you're going to see, 45% of the meta be Marines in this case, where Marines are just, they're well above everybody else.
Sure,
so
and
that's your
also
best chance to win.
not wildly out of whack. I mean, compared to the field as a whole, was still around 30%. So
yeah, the field as a whole was 27% Marines, and it's the same as like last year. Last year, going into LVO, the two lists that everybody were kind of looking at were Inari and like the Knight Castellan list, and that showed the majority of the top 100 that went to LVO last year. They ran either the Castellan list or the Inari list. And same thing, like they definitely made up, their proportion was higher than the rest of the like events proportion of those particular lists or factions.
Cool. All right. So a lot of people, essentially the reason why I wanted to have this talk is, those keyboard warriors out there, the big fish in the little ponds, or even just people who maybe are just pissed off that there's a really dominant list like the Broviathan or the Castellan list before it, and et cetera, might be saying that there's no such thing as player skill when you have a list that dirty. And I think the point here is that with a win rate of like 87% against the rest of the field, I think it's clear that the ITC top 100 perhaps have a little bit of a skill advantage versus people like you and I.
For sure. I mean, it even shows in other metrics. If you look at like the average game scores for these guys, like the average player scored at a 24 VP4, 24 against at LVO. The average top 100 player was 29-21. So and that's like with their losses included, they outscored their opponents by 8 points on average.
Wow.
Marine players almost by 11.
Now, that all being said, I mean, obviously there's a lot of skill to be had. I myself have always been a big fan of net listing because I don't have the list building skill, I don't have the tabletop skill, and I just want to bring something that can maybe win me a few games. Love that double Storm Surge, triple Riptide back in 7th. So what I want to ask you next here is the people who are in the, these guys are just net listing power gamers, do they have a point? Has that shown up in the numbers at all that, people who switch to, say, Space Marines or Iron Hands maybe do get a little bit of a lift to their performance?
Sure, yeah. There's a fellow that I talk to pretty frequently over on Discord who took my stats and kind of did some number crunching on my behalf. One of the things he looked at, this would have been about a month ago now, a few weeks before LVO, was he grabbed all of the records I had of players that had played different fractions prior to the Iron Hands release, and then compared it to those compared those self-same players to themselves after switching to Iron Hands.
Okay.
There was about 99 people that I had in my file that pre October had run something else, Eldar, whatever, and then switched to Iron Hands. So he took those 99, he broke it down into quartiles just to see how their win rates worked out. So the fourth quartiles are the best players that switched over. They went from a 77.3% win rate to a 76.5%. And that kind of jives with what you're normally going to see with, top end players, your Nick Nanavadis, your Nick Roses. There's a ceiling that you're eventually going to hit where, you're just not going to get better than that percentage point. And that's 75 to 80% is generally where you're going to see it, right? Because that's an average of one loss per event.
Right.
So your fourth quartile, definitely, not much of a change.
Yeah.
But that meant that they were staying on par given the meta change. Third quartile players, so that's that next 25. They went from an average win rate of about 63 to 68. So definitely saw a major improvement.
Yeah.
The crazy stuff is when you look at like the bottom performers. So your second quartile players went from about an average win rate of about a 52. So these guys are, your median players. Generally, your 3 and 2s, your 3 and 3s.
Your lunch pail and hard hat GT goers, just going in, getting games in.
Yeah, they're not bad players. They're not 0-5ing everywhere, but
right.
They went from a 52% to a 68% win rate on average.
Wow. Okay.
And then finally, your bottom quartile switchers, these guys, they had an average win rate of 31%. So the bottom 24, 25 guys, 31% win rate.
God bless.
God bless them. They're doing their best. They bumped up to a 61.
No. That's amazing. So they went to like a 3-2 record basically? Or like even
so
4-1?
They went to a consistent, 3-2 when they were, mostly a 1-4. when you compare that to just like regular quartiles for factions as a whole, and by the way, like this isn't how Iron Hands play out when you look at them as like an entire faction. Like if you look at new players that come in with Iron Hands, like the bottom quartile for Iron Hands is still it's about a 40%, which is extremely high when you compare it to anybody else. It's about a 39. But that's your normal bottom quartile if you don't account for, people that have experience playing this game.
Yeah.
But if you look at, say, the bottom quartile for Eldar players, it's like a 26, 27%, and they're essentially like the quote unquote second best faction in the game right now. Your bottom quartile for Chaos Space Marine players is like a 23% win rate. So having a group of guys, essentially 100 of them come in at a 61 is absolutely absurd. It does show like the kind of power that Iron Hands brought in to the game. Yeah. I don't know what else there's really to say on that.
I think that was a brilliant data set to just dive through. I'm really glad we did it. I think if there's a thesis point to this show, is that good players work hard to be good, and you can get good apparently you can get better by net listing a little bit, maybe switching to Iron Hands.
Just playing what's legitimately good. Right? Play what's hot. It definitely helps.
It definitely helps, but also let's that top quartile. They stayed top quartile, and I think a lot of that, and maybe they juiced their performance by a percentage point or two, but they didn't drop necessarily, right? Or they also
by
made
like
the
half
switch.
a point.
I think that's another big thing too, is they made the switch, right? So like a top player is going to go to what works, going to make that right strategic decision, right? So I don't know.
Yep. No, and that's just kind of I think how it is in competitive play. I do see sometimes people get there's a weird sense of betrayal from some people, because they love Tau, and then they see Richard Siegler jump to Iron Hands, and it's like he stabbed them in the back over doing it.
Yeah.
People, I saw comments like people like, I'm really disappointed that he switched to win the LVO, and it's like, well,
I hope there's some like really awesome freaky deaky like anime Tau artwork that comes out of that betrayal. Maybe just getting super edgy, like just something weird from the depths of the internet involving Richard Siegler. I'd love to see it.
Anyway, that's some bad juju you're putting out there, Val. But yeah, anyway, I just think it's very strange that people get that way, because these guys are in it to win it, and if that's your goal, sometimes you need to make that switch until the game kind of resettles back to something a little better. Siegler's already said he's looking at switching either to Grey Knights or back to Tau in the near future, depending on how their new Psychic Awakening stuff plays out. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess it's time that we got on with the show.
Yeah, let's do it.
Tournament news is made possible by BestCoastPairings.com. Download the BCP TO app to organize events for just about any tabletop game system. Download the player app to easily find and participate in events from around the world. Subscribe to BCP for as little as $5 a month to support the team and unlock additional features. Available for iOS and Android. BestCoastPairings.com. Competitive events easier.
Welcome to CanCon, the Australian culmination of the ITC season. Positioned as the grand finale for the Australian 40K circuit and officially dubbed the Australian Championship this year, which is why you probably all had trouble finding it in Best Coast Pairings. CanCon has a history of being a pretty devastating gauntlet of an event. Unlike other majors that may cut to a top 8 after 2 days of play, CanCon says no. It goes for a full 8 rounds of 40K for everyone involved.
This year, 182 of the sweatiest, what do they call that kind of t-shirt that has no sleeves?
A singlet?
A singlet, yeah, singlet-wearing players banded together for the Grand Bash, and every name from the competitive Australian meta was in attendance, outside of the handful that made their way over to Las Vegas instead. We talked in the LVO pre-show about Matt Morrisoli, who was flying over as he won the ITC for Australia last year. He did go 5-1, although he did take a pretty brutal arse kicking to Steve Pamprine in, I believe, round 4 of the event.
Matt Morrisoli also went about 7-1 as in 7'1". The guy is a monster.
He is, but he's only 120 if you ask him.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, regardless of that, we also had Simon Gojkovic show up. He's one of the founders of Godhammer Gaming, and I believe an ex-member of the Australian ETC team. He had a really good performance. He also went 5-1. I believe his only loss was to John Lennon, who made it to the quarterfinals. And I mean,
what was
of
the
course,
only undefeated Australian of the weekend that we know of?
who was that?
Adam Camilleri.
Ah, yes, because he was in the booth with us. Anyway, there were really no surprises at the top of the standings moving into the final day of games. Two-time previous winner, Jeremy Marigold Martino, he ended up in third place. He was running a mostly Death Watch list with a little bit of Blood Angels in for spice. Last year's winner, Eric the Ladies' Man Lathuris, ended up going 6-0 before taking his first loss, running 150 neophytes in his Gene Stealer cult list.
Mm-hmm.
And then Lee the Bull Abbey ended up in second with just some good old Iron Hand stuff. Just take a look in your codex and take 3 of the things you like the most and make it Iron Hands.
Alrighty. Well, before we move on to some of the finale details, I just want to direct anyone who's sort of intrigued about how a 150 neophyte laden GSC list could have performed so well under the stewardship of Eric Lathuris. Please go check out Art of War. It's fantastic. He's actually got 2 different episodes. He's got one about his Gaunt list with Tyranids, and he's got his most recent GSC. I mean, you got to call it a triumph in this day and age, doing what he did at CanCon. So, moving along on this painful segue, we're going to go to the actual CanCon finals, which would come down to Liam the Good Dr. Hackett's Flashgit Grant Mob taking on Chris T800 Wright's Brostralian take on what has been dubbed the Broviathan list. Much like most of the meta that has come face-to-face with that list, Hackett's Carpet of Grots was not up to the task and fell just short to the inevitable force that is the Terminator. Let's settle a quick question here. Which list is crazier, Liam Hackett's or Eric Lathuris? Over to Liam for the answer.
So obviously Eric Lathuris is one of Australia's very, very best players, and he has his own sort of special brand of crazy with the Tyranids. I would say I am crazier, and primarily because I took approximately 300 models of a completely shite variety, that being Gretchen, toughness 2, absolute garbage, and everything else. I think in general orc lists tend to be very extreme, so if the question is who's crazier out of Eric and I would humbly put my hand up to say that would be me. The Gretchen Horde in general is a very, very different beast to a Gaunt Carpet, primarily because its durability is only in its weight of bodies. The actual bodies themselves have absolutely no quality, and your durability primarily comes from advancing, charging, getting in combat, and using tricks to survive rather than the inherent durability of models like Plague Bearers or Zangors or things like that. So in terms of raw craziness, scale of crazy from 1 to 10, I take the cake.
So before we go into the hive mind mentality that comes from multiple players across the world somehow coming up with the same archetype simultaneously, I think we do need to talk a little bit about Liam Hackett and this absolutely ridiculous list.
It's an insane list that he has, it's premeditatedly insane. Like, he's been working on this Carpet of Grots for a long time, and also went through extensive amount of effort to get the Flashgits to include in it as well.
Yeah, and if that was to be honest, when I was taking a look at it, that was the first thing that popped out at me. I didn't even I kind of, like I always do when I look at orc lists, I kind of gloss over the Gretchen because I just oh, there's Gretchen in the list, there has to be. And it was only after I was like, well, where's all the points, that I went back and I was like, oh, there's way more Gretchen than normal in this list.
Yeah.
Just a lot more. I mean, Nick Rose did run 500 Gretchen at ETC last year, I believe it was. So, we've seen something like this in the past, but this is a pretty decent extreme for what's essentially an ITC. Well, it is an ITC event. Yes,
and I mean, we should also remind folks of the fact that there were some prominent players. One might say Nick Nanavati, who was basically saying that he believed that the best list that you could have brought in the meta that revealed itself would have been like the 300 Gaunt list that Eric Lathuris once ran, or maybe 300 grots. What do you think? Actual Liam Hackett.
Yeah, so I think Nick and a number of other people were quite curious about whether or not the true Horde meta would actually be a counter to Marines. I don't think they were wrong. I actually disagree with that, and I think the answer is not, is Horde the counter to the Marine meta? The answer is, what can you add to a Horde list to actually make it more effective at countering Marines? For example, my experience at CanCon, where I lost to Chris and Lee Abbey, both playing Iron Hands, I felt like I wasn't so much let down by the Horde component of my list, but rather the other things I had put in there to supplement the Horde, something I'm definitely going to be working on. I think Horde is really hard for Marines to actually counter for a number of reasons, and the fact that their shooting is such high quality, and I think that Hordes actually still retains that inherent durability that comes from weight of bodies that I think Marines is actually Marines actually sometimes struggle to fight. I disagree that I think they were wrong.
Well, if you look at Jeff Poole's performance, who ran 120 boys, a bunch of tank busters, and a whole ton of grots, you could see it definitely panned out for him. Anthony Birdsong, I've mentioned on a couple podcasts now. He was I believe the only player at LVO to only play Marines for all 6 rounds. He went 5-1. His list was 150 boys, 150 grots, and 3 sags, 3 weird boys. That was essentially it.
Right.
Like the whole point was, here's just 300 bodies you have to get through that I can teleport around. Meanwhile, I'm pumping out 15 smites, 15 mortal wounds of smites a turn, and shooting big giant lasers at you that you can't get at because there's 300 bodies in the way.
And one of the pioneers of the 3 giant lasers behind a bunch of stuff was in fact Liam Hackett. He was one of the first guys anyway I noticed running the 3 triple shock attack guns. Maybe even pre-relic, but I might be pouring that on too much.
I think you are, but definitely the first signs of triple sag were from the kind of Australian meta, particularly out of Liam. I noticed them as well back in like the BrizCon days, etc.
So how upset do you think Liam is by the fact that he went 9 grueling rounds, essentially made it crawled his way to the top table, had a shot? I don't know if he would have pulled it out in the end, spoilers. If he would have been able to leapfrog even, because he would have tied on record with Chris.
With 5 other people, because there were a lot of 7-1s.
Yes.
I believe he would have needed a really good game against Chris, a high scoring one, but it was definitely not outside the realm of probability by any means.
Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that Jeff Poole, he did great. He did really amazing. He made top 8 at LVO. It's a historic moment, but he immediately loses and goes home and hits the buffet. Like he's done. Meanwhile, Liam Hackett is in Australia in the summertime, sweating his balls off, I'm sure, and loses on top table. And does anyone care? This happened like 3 weeks ago. No one cares about the Australian meta, least of all Pablo.
It's basically like Florida to him.
It's essentially Florida. It is the droopy balls to the Florida meta. I think that's exactly what it is.
Why don't we take a listen to what Liam has to say on the matter?
I was not mad at all with Jeff Poole's performance. In fact, I was actually one of the people who, while I was at CanCon, I was checking the results and rooting for him every step of the way. I think that Orcs are really struggling at the moment in the meta, particularly a list like Jeff's, actually. I think should be applauded for doing as well as it did. Clearly has a good pilot behind it. I don't think that Jeff's success is anything short of extraordinary, and I think he should be applauded for it. As far as whether or not I'm upset about toiling in anonymity with my fungus farm down here, not at all. I think working on some powerful things in quiet is a merit to itself. I look forward to be blunt, I hope to surprise some people in the August of 2020 with some Gretchen-related lists, one might say. But look, we'll find out.
All right, well, that was a little bit surprising. I thought maybe Liam was slightly more hard done by, but surely he's going to be quite salty about the state of the Orc meta and where that book has been left by the vile Space Marine meta that we have been crushed underneath.
I will always go out of my way to try and pioneer some Orc stuff. I think to be perfectly frank, the bland nature of a lot of Orc players' lists is really disappointing. I mean, our Codex has so much awesomeness in it. I really think that it should be played in a lot of a more diverse ways. I think it can be competitive in the current meta. I think it should be competitive in the current meta, and I look forward to trying to prove that. I really enjoy talking, I guess, with anyone who wants to have a chat about competitive list design, because there's more books than just orcs that really should be a bit more diverse. And I think it's up to the players to really try and make that happen on a competitive level. Val, if you ever want to talk shit, talk productively, talk horribly, talk about Adam Camilleri, please hit me up. I'm happy to tell you all the juicy stuff.
Well, for some reason, Liam hasn't really taken the bait on any of the topics I've been trying to bring him out with, and he seems to be positive and constructive, and maybe, if anything, he'll take me up on calling Australia the droopy balls of the Florida meta, which is harsh, granted, but I mean, it's the only way we get content. So let's see, is Liam really all that upset about the credit that Australia gets out there in the 40k community?
As a real closing remark, I just wanted to say that, look, I think that over time the world competitive 40k scene is growing and becoming more diverse, and I'm really enjoying it, but probably at a higher rate the Australian scene is really becoming an incredibly competitive environment, and to be frank, anyone who thinks differently needs to reevaluate those choices. I really hope that the Australian team this year at the World Team Championships can tear some shit up, to be perfectly honest, and prove that statement to the rest of the world. And I look forward to speaking to you again, Val. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
The shot heard round the world. If you think differently about Australia having some competitive players, then you might have to reevaluate your choices. Falcon, I need to sit down after that smack talk.
But now I think we should really move on to the actual event winner, and the latest addition, actually, to Team Australia 2020, Chris Wright. Chris this year, he had a really amazing 2019 season. He won multiple events, and not just with a singular faction. Chris is well known for basically hopping factions very quickly and performing well with all of them. He won events this year with Eldar, Craftworld, and Drukhari, with Deathwatch. I believe he had a couple of really good performances with Mono Guard and with Space Marines. He always seems to be on the cutting edge of the current meta, and it's not something you frequently see out of Australia. A lot of the guys there, just due to the custom models and other factors, kind of tend to stick to the same thing event to event. But Chris is one of the few that he doesn't care. He swings for the fences every time.
Now, the interesting thing about Chris's list this year is how similar it is to the Broviathan list that took the LVO by storm with just a handful of modifications. Now, keep in mind that these are two events happening on the same weekend with list cutoffs at roughly the same time. Am I right about the list cutoff, Pete? Yeah,
you're 100% correct. This is kind of a one of those great things that happens when, great minds figure out lists, opposite sides of the world. It just happened to be around the exact same time. Similar to, when Edison created the light bulb. There were probably 5 or 6 other people also making light bulbs. He just ran to the patent office the fastest.
Or in a much more succinct idiom, great minds think alike. The list acts...
I don't work that way.
For all intents and purposes in the same manner as the Brohammer one, and I may actually like this one a little bit more.
So my friend Connor Keane and I had been testing a lot of different Space Marine builds, but we found that almost everything was vulnerable to going second against the Marine gun line, particularly if they rolled hot. So I wanted an army that had enough resilience to withstand one of these alpha strikes, and I really wanted to have something with a good board presence. And I think the reason I came to such a similar list to the Brohammer guys is because Iron Hands Intercessors does this so much better than everything else. And then another benefit of being Iron Hands is you can take an unkillable Dreadnought. So I was tossing up between a Relic Contemptor and a Leviathan. But the rest of the list really lacks volume of fire, and the Leviathan does such a good job of controlling a section of the board that I decided to go with that. There were a few differences in the list though. So I had some Thunderfires where the Brohammer guys didn't, and I think that's largely just because I'm playing in the Australian meta. In Australia, you always expect some of the top players to be on Horde lists, so I think the Thunderfire cannons were a must for me. The other thing was the Impulsor that Connor and I had. So I just love an Impulsor. They do so many different things in so many matchups. One thing I like to do is put the Eliminators in them, so I had 2 units for Eliminators. It really makes it hard for your opponent to avoid them because they get essentially a 20-inch move, which means they're either hiding like right behind a ruin or I can reach them. You can also make the Impulsor an engineers unit, put some intercessors in it, and they can be your other engineers. That can be really hard to shift, and that is great at scoring objectives, recon, bonus points, and if you get intercessor squad down to one model or something, they can do a great job of denying that kill.
Alrighty, Pete. So there's the man himself with the upside Aussie version of the Broviathan list. What are your thoughts on the addition of the Impulsor and the Thunderfires?
I'm a big fan of the Thunderfires. I think, especially if you talk to some of the other Brohammer guys, Siegler himself mentioned he didn't feel that the Chaplain Dreads did as much work as he wanted them to, and if he were to modify the list, he would drop one or two of them.
Mm-hmm.
So seeing other people do just that, drop a Chaplain Dread to add in extra tech, I think is a great idea. 2 Thunderfire cannons. Thunderfire cannons are amazing. I think everybody knows that. It gives you some extra protection against, fast-moving infantry lists, just by being able to slow them down.
Right.
But like Chris said, it's also extra tech against hordes. You're not going to deal with 300 grots with 2 Thunderfire cannons, but you're going to pick up that few extra models that a singular Chaplain Dread in your background shooting 2 las cannons are going to pick up, and that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And the Impulsor. That's the one that I don't agree with him on as much. I love the his reasoning for it, using it to give extra threat range on eliminators, engineers, etc. It all makes perfect sense. I just find, and this may be because the North American meta is so different. You're always got to be afraid of that Imperial Fist list that you're going to run into that just picks up the Impulsor with one set of Thunderfire cannon or rapier carrier shots, and then you just gave him essentially a free kill because it's essentially the only targetable vehicle in your list.
Right, but I mean, I don't think we can fully steer clear of all vehicles, just because of that one potential counter. And I granted, I get your point, but even just having one does limit really how much they can get out of that keyword. And even there's a list later on where we see 2 in a similar list design. I kind of like the move to the Impulsor for a lot of the reasons why the players say, and also because I'm a dummy, never once did it occur to me that eliminators could go in a transport.
Yeah, that is because you're a dummy. Now, the one thing about the Broviathan list is that it's really good at killing other Marines and elite armies in general, while still putting a hurt on most other big lists that you see in the current meta. That being said, as the good doctor mentioned earlier, it does need to work a smidge harder against the right horde setups. According to Chris, though, not that much harder. After defeating his friend and teammate Lee Abbey in round 6, Wright would have to barrel through Eric Lathuris's Neophyte Horde in round 7 to make it to the final.
My toughest game over the weekend was definitely the one against Eric Lathuris, so he's a fantastic player. I'm sure many people have heard of him. So he was on a Gene Seal Occult Horde with tons and tons of Neophytes with the mining lasers. So that was a really interesting match. My list is really designed to beat other Space Marine lists, but of course I've got a lot of intercessors in there, which are good against hordes. Really makes it hard for them to pressure me combat-wise, and it has got a better codex than him. So it was a really interesting match. I got up by 1 point. I think the fact that my list denies secondaries so well was the key to that. He really had a hard time picking and scoring secondaries, whereas I was able to just take Reaper and Engineers and something else and score most of mine. But it was a really fantastic close game. In general, I think the idea of using hordes to counter Space Marines it's got some merit, but I think most Space Marine lists, even though they're not designed to beat hordes, have some tools in there. So my list had lots of intercessors. Other lists that don't have lots of bodies tend to have some pretty high rate of fire weapons, like you might have some repulsors which get just a billion guns on there. The planes have lots of shots. So I think, there's some merit to the idea, but in general, Space Marine lists are going to have incidentally some things which deal with hordes, and that's going to make it really tough for them. And that kind of showed over the weekend. So the really good horde players, Eric Lathuris and Liam Hackett, did quite well. but they still had a tough tournament.
That just about wraps up our coverage of CanCon, the culmination of the Australian 40K ITC season. And although we, as Australians might say, took the piss a little bit and probably didn't use the C word nearly as much as they would have liked, I think it goes without saying that the Australian meta's got a lot of really interesting things going on, and much like how they've evolved a lot of independent species that are kind of like animals that we have, except a little bit weird and messed up, and a combination of lizards and mammals and marsupials and things.
Wolves and spiders.
Exactly. Look, I'm rambling a little bit, but the point is that Australia matters in the meta, and it's filled with a lot of good blokes, and, you know, they pay a lot more for models than we do, and let's cut them some slack. And, you know, this Chris guy who just won CanCon, he's a super nice guy, and we're going to let him have the last word. Is that cool with you, Falcon?
It's always cool with me.
Even 2 weeks later, I still can't believe that I managed to make my way through all 8 rounds of CanCon undefeated. So excited to have won such a big tournament. And that put me in first place for Australia ITC for the 2019 season, which wins me a ticket to the LVO next year. So I'll see a lot of you guys there. Very excited for that. And I'd like to say a big thanks to my friend and testing partner, Connor Keane, who really helped me with the list. Josh McMillan gave me some great advice with some of the ways I could use the impulsor, and lots of people supported me on my way. My parents were always really, really fantastic, so thanks for that.
Tournament news.
Hey everybody, I'm Paul Murphy from Forge the Narrative, and you're listening to 40K Stat Center.
As they say, while the cats are away, the mice will play. Such was the case this last weekend when all the boys and girls that had their invitations lost to the Belgian Team Championships made their way to Bournemouth for the annual Beachhead Brawl event.
Another shocking 6-round event in the European scene. Bravo, bravo. Beachhead was the first real major to come out after the LVO, and the first to include the new rules for Grey Knights, Thousand Sons, and Dark Angels. Wow. And what rules those are. I mean, Dark Angels are hot, aren't they, Pete?
Yeah, I mean, they got good Talon Masters. They're good.
First question. Did you write the additional rules for Dark Angels in Psychic Awakening? True or false, you are the Ricio's version of Dark Angels?
I mean, I'll neither confirm nor deny that I had anything to do with one of the more mediocre Psychic Awakening releases for a particular faction.
That's fair enough. Well, there are many other less mediocre releases in that, most of them contained in the Grey Knight section, and that sigh of relief you heard from around the world was the oxygen going back into the lungs of Grey Knights players far and wide after the boot of underpoweredness was removed from their chests that has been in place basically since 7th edition. So it's fantastic. There's maybe a competitive build, possibly, and we're going to hear about it a little bit later.
Yeah, for sure. No, Grey Knights definitely got quite the boost. Thousand Sons saw probably way more rules than I think most Thousand Sons players thought they would see. You know, essentially getting their own list of sub factions, stratagems, warlord traits, etc. And I mean, Dark Angels, they got Talon Masters to be good again. They already were great. Mm-hmm. A couple little tricks, but I don't think they're going to see the exact same impact that our Grey Knight and Thousand Sons players will see in the meta.
Now, this year, at the Bournemouth Beachhead Brawl, there would be 2 undefeated tables going into the last round, as Vic the Vindicator VJ's Brexithiathan. Brexithiathan?
I don't know. I wanted to make a Brexit joke. It's real hard, though. I feel bad.
It's pretty good. Anyway, as I was saying, Vic's list would browbeat Malik Amin the Dream Rubio's Imperial Fists, and Lawrence the Spider Baker's Grey Knights would banish Greg Champagne Room Chamberlain's Possessed Bomb. Both would end up undefeated, giving perennial favorite Vic the win on tiebreakers and battle points and the current top spot in the ITC 3 minutes into the season.
So we sat with Vic to talk about what it takes to pick up a known quantity like the Broviathan list and make it your own.
Over to you, Vic.
Hey guys, Vic here. Happy to be on the show again, and I'm just going to be talking about my time at the Beachhead Brawl this past weekend. It was a very, very well-run event. I really had a very great time. It was only slightly marred by the fact that I disappointed a lot of my friends and family by bringing a very filthy Iron Hands list. Essentially, I took the LVO winning list and made a few small modifications to it. And Val's just asked me if I could run through my justification for why I made a few of those changes, so here we go. Essentially, the main change I made to the list was dropping one of the Chaplain Venerable Dreadnoughts and a few of the Intercessors in order to run a couple of Impulses. I did a little bit of testing with the list before I went into the tournament, and I found that the Impulses just added a little bit of extra flavor to the list. They let you hide the Eliminators on turn 1, which extends a little bit of their threat range because they can disembark after the Impulsors moved, so you can get some nice angles for direct shots if that's the way you want to play the game. Now, I never actually did that, but the threat of it was enough to cause people to deploy a little bit differently. The other thing that you could do is also play a little bit more cagey and actually hide a bit more, because you have a very long reach to get objectives if you're going second for the hold more in ITC missions. And thirdly, it's a really brilliant screen against Raven Guard and Blood Angels, and I knew there were a few very good players who were bringing those two armies. In terms of strategies to how to actually counter this list, seeing as it's probably going to pop up all over the place for the next month or so, I would say that you've got two approaches. One is to capitalize on your opponent's mistakes, kind of like what we've just spoken about. And the other one is probably to, especially if you have an aggressive army, let's say a Chaos Possessed Bomb, Eldar with Seer Council or multiple Shining Spears unit, is to be very aggressive and really hit hard with everything at once and try and take apart the list. And leave him with very small number of assets from a very early point of the game. When you have a list that can also assert some kind of board control, it can be very hard for the Iron Hands list to catch up on points in that case. Otherwise, it's always going to be a tough one, and you just got to grind it out and hope you can get something out of that game.
All right, Pete, so now we've gotten two distinct scenarios. We've got the Breviathan list or the Australian list, whatever you want to call it, both evolving in separate continents based on some pretty core list concepts that are, the same or similar. Now you've got Vic, who's bringing in his own flavor to it, basically, improving on its design in his view and making it work for himself. How far do you think this list go? Is the Leviathan the new Castellan?
I don't know if it's the new Castellan. I think I like to liken it to, and what I assume it'll end up being is very similar to after BAO, not last year, but the year before, when Don Huson won with his Renegade Knight Blight Lord Terminator combo.
Right.
That was a list that saw a lot of replay. Mainly because it was a relatively, I'm not going to say simple because I don't want to insult Don. But the concept was simple. This is what these things do, and it works. So you saw it get copied by a lot of people after that win. I think you're going to see something very similar here. I mean, the list is obviously devastating. It's very hard to counter.
But I mean, we're talking about three majors, 1, 2, 3, the same list archetype, right?
I know.
Huson's list never did anything like that.
We're going to be talking about another one where it top tabled. So, it's definitely a devastating list. I think the big thing to come out of this is going to be, where the meta is right now. Raven Guard are definitely have a chance against it because Vic kind of mentions it at the end. Here's how I think you beat it. But the other thing is that we have a big FAQ coming in 2 months, and I would imagine what you'll see leading up to that FAQ, if it happens, is people trying to create lists that are not the Leviathan list, simply because they have a whole rest of the season they have to play through with an assumption that list is going to get hit, just because it performed so well and it continues to do so. Right? It's not like GW isn't completely blind to how these things work. So if you see that list show up and on stream, on their own stream, it's, soaks whatever the final tally was from Brad's last hurrah, where he put like 40 some odd wounds into the Leviathan, and it only took 3, or whatever the end result was. That's something where hopefully, the right people looked, and you see a change come April.
I mean, the reality is, though, that we have. I mean, it's not that it's impossible, and I like to remind folks that it is entirely with their control and infinite wisdom to make changes to the game at any time. But they've committed to their twice a year schedule. They seem to have been a little bit slow on a couple things recently for whatever reason. So I don't think we're seeing an update before, say, Adepticon. And Adepticon, other large events notwithstanding, is kind of the air horn to the start, really, of the new ITC season. And
for
so
sure,
we're going to see, just like it was obvious that something was going to change when the Tyranid Hive Tyrant list was bombing around with 7 or 8 Hive Tyrants. We didn't know when it was going to change. Well, we knew when it was going to change. We didn't know how it was going to change. So we don't know what they're going to do, and they're probably not going to do it before a lot of important events happen. So if you're a person who just needs to add a Leviathan to maybe pick up a GT or Major, I think we're going to be seeing this archetype a lot. So are there any counters outside of Raven Guard that, which, again, may or may not actually even work, that, think actually has legs against this?
Really, I think Vic hits the nail on the head. You got to wait for a mistake and hope for the best. Outside of maybe that Raven Guard bomb where you constantly hit the opponent, and because you have to clear all those intercessors, right? To beat this list, those intercessors need to all be dead. As we saw, even then you can run into trouble, because if you watch our stream when Manny Chima plays John Lennon, he kills all the intercessors by like turn 3.
Right.
But then the Leviathan mixed with the Apothecary and Iron Father Pharaohs just survive the rest of the shooting for 3 full rounds. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if we look at in terms of maybe not seeing this, at least I hope we don't see this as being too crazy. Other than Adepticon, I bet it'll be everywhere. Is if you look at LVO. Last year,
right?
Not the one, but the one prior. Just prior to LVO, people said LVO is the last gasp for Inari.
Right.
It was said by playtesters and some others, and some of those same playtesters said the same thing about the Castellan.
Right.
And what you saw all around LVO, other than LVO itself,
right,
was a dip in Castellan play and a dip in Inari play. Both of the Inari significantly went down to about like 3% of the meta up until the LVO, and the Castellan dropped probably about 5 or 6 percentiles as well, and that was mainly because people in the know said this list is dead once this major event happens. Now it ended up being a little bit longer than that for both, but it wasn't that much longer. So in my mind, my hope is that we see something similar where someone says, hey guys, you have to realize this is a known commodity now. Maybe start thinking outside the box in preparation for when this dies. But like you just said, if you're looking to, snag a top performance at a GT or a major, this list definitely does look to be the one to beat.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you've actually missed perhaps the best counter that could be imagined, which would be thousands of adoring fans, the perfect Widow's Peak hairline, and 3-day-old stubble. All right, as promised, we are now joined by Lawrence Baker of TabletopTactics.tv fame, and also of recent tournament acclaim. Mr. Baker, what happened this past weekend? Where were you?
I was at. Thank you for the introduction, by the way, Val. It's a pleasure to be on your show. So I was at the Bournemouth Grand Tournament, which is in the UK, by the beach, and it was called Beachhead Assault. So it was rather appropriately named.
Well, that is wonderful. There's a nice quote from Snatch about English beaches, which I won't repeat here. I'm glad you picked that one up. So, and it was a real tournament too. They called it a grand tournament, but it was damn near 100 people, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So I think 101 turned up on the Saturday, and about 96 finished, or something in that region. So 6 rounds, fast and furious, 4 games on the Saturday and 2 games on the Sunday. So yeah, pretty much as big as you can get in terms of an ITC major by UK standards, bar of course, the London Grand Tournament. I think it must be certainly the biggest that we've had this year so far.
Now, 6 rounds in the United Kingdom. I mean, were they handing out like orange slices so that people didn't get lightheaded? Were there stretcher bearers around?
There was lots of tea, of course, being shared around. Some scones, your classic stereotypical English things to get us through the day. I have to admit, after the 4th game on the Saturday, I was wrecked.
Yeah. And I mean, stiff upper lip and all that, and you guys pulled through. I'm really proud of you. Here on Stat Center, we have been advocating for, there not to be 4 or 5 winners of UK Grand tournaments and majors. So I'm glad to see this time there were only 2, and one of them was Lawrence Baker, my man. Really, really pleased to see it because you were trotting out the beloved Hammers of Titan.
Yeah, that's right. The old Grey Knights. They've come out of the warp from nowhere, it seems.
I mean, that's what happens when you come out from the warp. I don't know if you've ever seen it before, but, it's kind of the thing. That's what it's about. I mean, Drago just sort of appears wherever he's needed, and he was needed, I'm not sure, not in your list, but why don't we touch on that? What were you running with the new Psychically Awakened? Because, I mean, they were pretty woke already on the psychic stuff, but now they're even more woke. What were you running?
Well, I mean, it's funny actually because I always felt that they were distinctly asleep before Psychic Awakening, even in the psychic phase. But certainly Psychic Awakening has really brought them up to speed, competitively speaking, which is great. I sort of took the whole of the last year out of the tournament scene.
Mm-hmm.
I was too busy building a studio. But prior to that, I did try and make the Grey Knights work during the early 8th edition days, and it was just not a good look. It really wasn't. But now with these new rules, all of a sudden you can, and a couple of the points drops over the last couple of chapter approved, it's really, really worked out for them. So the premise of the list was why take 1 Paladin bomb when you can take 2? So I did a little bit of play testing.
Right.
Quickly identified that.
Not on the channel, by the way, which I've been feverishly waiting for. We posted a narrative report, and I'm like, what is he going to do with his Grey Knights?
I know, and I saw your comment on social media. You're like, Grey Knights finally get some good rules, and you post a narrative report.
Because you didn't want to tip your hand.
I've been filming some Grey Knights. Don't worry, I've done some competitive ITC reports with them. They just haven't been released yet.
Glad to hear it.
Which is kind of cool, actually, because you'll see a bit of the development, how I got to the list that I've taken.
Mm-hmm.
I also did a couple of off-camera games where we just proxied things like your classic Chaplain Dreads and the Boogeymen lists against Iron Hands and stuff. And I basically quickly came to the realization that 1 Paladin bomb was brilliant, but if I could get 2 in and then fuel them with enough CP via a dual battalion, that should give me the resilience I need to sort of last the first couple of turns and then get to the point where I've got board control and I've taken out enough of the enemy units to start scoring the points to win the game.
Yeah.
And it turns out that, hey, that worked pretty well. So
absolutely.
6 games later, and I managed to get 2nd place.
Yeah, and I mean, just looking at the battle points, clearly you were playing the mission rather tightly. What sort of secondary objectives were you selecting? Because it was an ITC event.
It was indeed, yeah. So it would typically depend on my matchup, of course. But I did face some of the Boogeyman lists, like I did the Raven Guard 16 Centurion list. Obviously, I took Gangbusters against him. He had a lot of characters with Thunderfire Cannon, so I had Headhunter. I picked Old School, funnily enough, quite a bit in a lot of my matchups, mainly because you've got a power called Astralane, which is really fantastic at taking out like an encamped little 5-man scout unit or a 5-man older ranger unit, which usually is sitting on an objective behind an L-shaped building.
Mm-hmm.
But with Astralane, I was able to just go, well, I don't need line of sight and I'm ignoring your cover, and I'll just put my Stormbolters from this gated Terminator unit, Paladin unit rather, into that unit and then kill them, getting first strike very easily and taking you off of an objective, which otherwise you would try and hold for the majority of the game.
Right.
So it was really, really useful.
Fantastic. And were you starting, both halves of that Paladin coin on the table, or were those things you bring in? Really?
Yeah, oh, yeah, dude, this is an all-in list. It's not for the faint of heart. You're either there to play or you go home. That's it. The paladins are on the board.
Both. So immediately when you think about like, why not do 2 paladin bombs? Well, obviously, because you can't put, all of your resources into both bombs. You got, a lot of stratagems are used to buff, a lot of psychic powers used to buff, especially on the defensive side. So how were you managing that? Like, wouldn't people just sort of kill the one that wasn't all powered up and juiced?
Well, that's the beauty of, because a couple of things which work really, really well generally in an ITC format anyway. First thing is you're generally going to have, there's a couple of L-shaped blocks of terrain in the middle, and you usually have, some line of sight blocking either in your deployment zone, or you can deploy in such a way that you can mitigate a lot of the enemy firepower. So I've effectively found I could start both the paladin units on the board, and even if I didn't go first, they would typically target one unit, and I would be in Tide of Shadow. So if I'm in cover, I'm a -1 to hit, and I have an effective 1+ save on those paladins. And then on top of that, you can go, right, transhuman physiology. So now you're only wounding me on 4s. If they then wanted to then start targeting the other paladin unit, I would just rely on the first turn of having my cover and the -1 to hit. And that generally worked fine. If you instead go first, what you do is you cast Armored Resilience on one, so it's a -1 to wound them.
Yep.
And then you cast Sanctuary on the other unit, and then you fling the -1 to wound unit up into the person's grill. If they choose to target the other unit, you just put Transhuman Physiology on them. So between the 2 units, you're actually really quite buffed up.
Yeah.
It's really quite hard to shift them.
There's also the double battalion, and you've got the strike squads. You were bringing 5-man Falcon kitted out units of strikes. And
That's right.
the strike is pretty cool, especially in the 2 damage smite world,
Exactly.
Because it's pretty damage dealy in the psychic phase. They've got a bunch of storm bolters, which is great, and they can also fight in combat. So I mean, they're kind of a triple threat. What were they doing for you throughout the games, aside from filling out those battalions?
Well, I mean, this really will help sort of fill out the tactics of how the list works. Another thing I sort of discovered in playtesting is that Strike Marines are actually pretty good value for their points with the new Tide rules, but they're obviously very vulnerable. They're just a 1 wound Space Marine, right? And when you're playing in a meta where there are a lot of ignore line of sight weapons like Thunderfire cannons and Whirlwinds, you can't afford to have those guys start on the board. There are some matchups where you can, obviously. Like I played a Possessed Bomb in the 6th game, and he didn't have that much firepower, so I was able to just start the strikes on the board. But generally, you need to have enough units on the board and points to ensure that all 6 units of Strike Marines can start in reserve.
Yeah.
So what I did is I fueled my 2 Paladin bombs. You need a lot of characters to get all of the powers you need to fuel them. So I took a Chaplain, a Librarian, a Brother Captain for the double range smites. I took Grandmaster Voldus because he's like a Librarian and a Grandmaster all rolled into one, so lots of extra powers. And then I took an Apothecary to help keep the Paladins alive. And when you start all of those units on the board, that actually gives you enough room to put the 6 units of strikes in reserve, and then keep them protected. So you can clear the enemy screens first and then bring the strikes in to take out the artillery in turn 2.
Right. And were you facing a lot of that indirect fire? Because, things like the, Thunderfire cannons and Whirlwinds that you were referring to, they tend to just, annihilate, especially, I don't know, did you run into any Imperial Fists that are ignoring the cover, that benefit that you have?
Yeah, so I didn't play Imperial Fists. I have played them in play testing. The cover is a funny one because generally speaking, even if they are ignoring the cover, starting with a base 2-up save is really quite good. Mm-hmm. And then I'm also able, if they do have the 2 damage Whirlwinds, I'm able to actually put a strat on the Paladins for a -1 damage, which is really neat. And when you're talking 3 wound Terminators effectively, it actually takes them a lot of firepower to start chewing through my unit.
Yeah, it's inefficient, right? Because you're not, every 2 wound scars, so you're losing a bit of damage effectiveness. So that feels good.
Yeah, absolutely. So it does feel good. I did face a fair bit of indirect fire, even when I did an Elder matchup at the GT as well, and he had 3 Night Spinners. And I was absolutely able to just negate their effectiveness. They just couldn't chew through the paladins fast enough. And so, yeah, the double paladin bomb was really, really resilient, actually. I was really impressed with it.
So true or false, you're coming into the final round, you're 5-0, you're feeling pretty cool. You got your Tabletop Tactics t-shirt on, you've been signing people's shirts and stuff throughout the day. And then you see Possessed Bomb matchup. Like, do you give yourself a little fist bump? You just clock that one as a W, just walking up to the table, or did a game incur? Because I've always assumed that, like, once we saw this Psychic Awakening, that was the end of Possessed Bomb nonsense. Did that actually turn out to be true?
That did turn out to be true. I mean, the guy that was piloting the Possessed Bomb, long time Chaos player, Greg, he's a great player. He knew his army very well, but I mean, he said as well immediately, he's like, this is a terrible matchup for me. And honestly, that was just fluke of all of the last matchups to have game 6, in that sort of final. And he's got a Possessed Bomb with 3 Plague Burst Crawlers and 1,000 Suns Supreme Command. Yeah. And I'm like, it's a gift to me, like I'm doing 4 damage smites for fun here. So, yeah, it was a rough matchup for him.
Because they got a lot of demon keyword, but no actual demons. So they don't have, he didn't have access to the weird anti-Grey Knight stratagem and stuff.
Yeah,
so.
Well, I just bring a unit back, exactly. So he had none of the benefits and I had all of them. So, it was very unfortunate.
So outside of that, so you had a bit of a layup in the last round. What actually gave you a run for your money, or was it all just tap dancing and laughs and high fiving, or were there a couple grinders?
Definitely not. Definitely not. I think I wouldn't say that the Grey Knights are like Iron Hands good at the moment, but I was able to claw victories. Like the Raven Guards matchup was obviously really tough, and that was a real tight game. It was like a 23-21 victory. So real tight, just a couple of points in it. And I think honestly, if I hadn't gone first, he might have had that, hard to say, but either way, it could have been a bad day for me, So I think with the Grey Knights, I haven't found that I'm able to score big victories, like your big 36, 42 point wins. Yeah. But you're able to get those consistent 25, 26 point wins over your opponent and outlast them. And that, I'm happy with that, to be honest. If I can even go toe to toe with the Marine meta using Grey Knights, like I'm very happy to do that, Val.
So are the Grey Knights what are they the cure to what ails the meta right now? Are they ironically they're Space Marines still, but let's just forget that for a moment. Are they the counter that's gonna knock some things loose here?
I think it would be remiss of a lot of players to discount them. I do think obviously it's going to change the Chaos meta pretty substantially. Yeah. But for the actual Marines, I do think they're going to have to start thinking about how they can shut a Grey Knights army down, at least psychically. Mm-hmm. Because you know what? They're a tough cookie to break, like even I'm just thinking about the matchup with the Centurions, even with the Flamers and the Hurricane Bolters in Tactical Doctrine, when I've got a -1 to wound strat on, psychic power on, they do not like that. They really do not like it. Right. It makes the Paladins quite daunting for them to actually kill.
Now, although you guys did play a grueling 6 rounds, you didn't play the 7th. So there's one other undefeated out there, I believe Vic VJ, right?
That's right. Great player, great list. He was running the Iron Hands Boogeyman list.
That's right. We're talking about it a bit in this episode. The Broviathan.
That's right.
What do you think your odds are up against something like that? What would happen if this thing went to a round 7?
You know what? I would have loved to have played that game. I would really have liked first turn in that matchup, to be honest with you. Obviously depends on terrain and so forth. I don't think I could take that list very comfortably. Do I think that I could win it? Yeah, it's possible. I mean, it's great. They're such a weird one because I negate a lot of the resilience with my mortal wound output. So if I can clear that screen early enough and get to that juicy Leviathan friends, he's in a bit of trouble. Yeah. But the question is, can I get through that screen quickly enough? you know what? I have to play the game and find out.
You're absolutely right. You're right to challenge Vic to a round 7 in your very own studio for On Demand. Did I hear that right? That you were calling him out?
You absolutely heard that correct. And look, I was speaking to Vic, and he's a great guy. I'd love to have him on the channel. So we will have a death match, and then we'll play 40K afterwards.
That's what we try to do on this show is show that competitive players can be charming and well-rounded individuals.
Yes.
But also, they are games. There's an actual game that can be played there, and it can be entertaining. And I'm sure you guys would have a stonker of a match.
Yeah, I think it would be great. Yeah, I think it would be really, really fun, actually.
Regardless of anything, I think it's a great achievement, a stunning result for how far back Grey Knights were even a month ago. So congratulations wholeheartedly. What's next for you? Are you getting out to any more tournaments this year?
Oh yeah, well I'm back on it this year. So I was retired last year, but I'm back to fighting fitness this year. So I'm booked in for the Blackheart GT, which is in Bristol coming up, and the Gibraltar GT as well. So I've got some big ones coming up.
Yeah, the Gibraltar GT, that's going to be actually a lot of fun because they're running a full-on GT. It's not just their invitational.
Exactly, you got it. So it should be exciting, that one. I think that is only 5 rounds, but I do think it's 90 players.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so they've expanded yet again. So it is a big one, certainly in terms of ITC points.
Well, that's pretty awesome. I wish you the best of luck out there. And just once more, maybe you can remind our listeners where people can find you.
Awesome, thank you. So you can check us out on tabletoptactics.tv. That's the website, and you can just Google Tabletop Tactics, and no doubt you'll find the YouTube channel.
Lawrence and his merry band of 40K players are always cranking out content on there, and Dungeons and Dragons.
That's right. We do everything.
For narrative reports and competitive reports and all kinds of fun stuff. I'm a big fan of this show.
That's it.
So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today, and I look forward to hopefully the Titans not getting too good, because I want you to keep playing, not having to switch off if it becomes the flavor of the week here.
No, I'm sticking with him this year, even if everyone bandwagons. I'm sticking with him.
All right, we got you on the record, so I'm glad to hear the Hammers of Titan will be spotted at a tournament near you, as long as you live in the UK. All right, man. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks, buddy.
Breaking news: 40K Stat Center. We interrupt this pre-recorded podcast to address the monstrous call-out that was made by Lawrence in that preceding interview. Early reports suggest that Vic is scared. We go now live to the also pre-recorded response from Vic.
And finally, there's been some word on the street that I'm too scared and refusing to take on Lawrence Baker on his YouTube channel for a no-holds-barred championship finale. I'd like to just say that is not the truth. I am always ready for that. I may not play with full commitment because nothing would make me happier than seeing the Grey Knights take apart this Iron Hands list.
You heard it here first, folks. Vic will not only accept this challenge, but he'll even promise to take it easy on Lawrence so that maybe the spider won't immediately get squished. How breathtakingly British.
Tournament news.
I'm Lawrence Baker.
And this is the B-Bone from Tabletop Tactics.
You're listening to 40K Stat Center.
Our final event today is the Wheat City Open, run in the deepest recesses of Brandon, Manitoba, Canada. The perfect location for a fun night being chased by a crazed madman through fields of golden grain. Wheat City was a 61-player, 6-round ITC extravaganza in the heart of hip territory.
And I just want to point out that the deepest crevice of Brandon, Manitoba is maybe like 1.5 feet deep. Like, it's actually not that dark. Like, Brandon...
No, it's essentially like perfectly level, just like that Rick and Morty episode.
Perfectly level, just like us as well, because we're on the level here with a bit of a quick hit recap of the Wheat City Open. 61 players, though, in Brandon, Manitoba. I don't know where they're getting all of these people.
I think it's mostly from like the Dakotas area, a little bit of the prairies. It's surprising how many guys they have out there. These guys, they run, I think, 3 majors a year, I want to say, in that Brandon area. And they always pull in like the good numbers. I'll have to say it's always like 58, 61. I mean, last year they were the first major that happened after the LVO, this exact major, the Wheat City. And it was won with Thousand Suns. It made me go on a little bit of a trip for a couple of weeks about Scarab Occult Terminators, because they'd just gotten a buff to their shooting.
Yeah,
and Ryan Mandrick
with
had won
drill,
with it.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, essentially. So, and Ryan Mandrick had run it and won with them. Thought it might become a thing, but then we got a bunch of new releases, as we always do, that made them absolutely useless again. And now here we are again. And it went a little bit differently.
Yeah, Ryan Mandrick's still involved in the tail of the tape, though. And as a very brief hint, he loses.
Yep.
Because an American showed up. From the Dakotas, no less.
Yeah, Cyle Thompson, the Warhog himself from Goonhammer, managed to take the win in this event. He came and stole our prized tournament trophy, as it were, from those poor baby seal Canadian hands.
Yeah, it prompted a lot of his fellow Goonhammer writers to question his motivation. So I got some comments from Kyle just about that craven shift that he made over to Iron Hands.
First off, it was a major. And no, I'm the guy who does power move army tray placements and makes sure to fill up my opponent's water bottle first so it's slightly warmer than mine.
Okay, a little bit of insight now. I'm starting to understand. It sounds like North Dakotans very similar to Canadians. I mean, that's some underhanded dirty tricks for a Manitoban. So fitting right in, Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, he definitely did that. Now, the big thing here is that Kyle, at least for this event, has switched over to Iron Hands, and it does seem to be something that he's looking to do in the future. Last year, Kyle did run mostly AdMech for the majority of his tournaments. He did dip into Dark Angels a few times and guard Dark Angel mix once and again, but AdMech was kind of his loyal mainstay. Val, did you happen to ask him why the sudden traitorous turn?
Well, I guess we're about to find out.
I own a very large Space Marine army, and I've accumulated since 5th edition, and love to put them on the table now that when they're remotely good. It sucks that they're now the boogeyman, because despite this list being kind of the Brevithian adjacent, I do like the new design space of having pre-game options with spells, warlord traits, and relics to tailor the list a bit against whatever my opponent's bringing to the table. As far as AdMech are right now, I think they're fine. I mean, I played Marines 4 times at LVO and split the wins. If the one Brohammer list I did run into didn't have a perfect L because of the top 100 terrain changes, I may have actually had a game. AdMech is playing from behind by having an early book, but with the aggressive point drops and additional model support they've received, there's a lot of there, and it has 2 or 3 very different builds that are competitive.
Alrighty, so something that our audience doesn't know at this point in the story is that although Kyle did switch over to Iron Hands, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Falcon, he didn't switch over to the Leviathan build that we've been discussing at length for the other part of the episode, but he switched to a Brigade version of Iron Hands, an old-fashioned chestnut at this point in the meta.
Yeah, for sure. He's running a brigade that's very similar to Nick Notavati's brigade that he had run prior to the LVO, before he, quote-unquote, YOLO'd to White Scars last minute. And in fact, while Nick has talked about, maybe the Horde answer was what was needed, in talking to Nick personally, he had said that he really wished that he had stuck to his Iron Hands brigade because, he had so many reps with it. And he felt it had a legitimate chance, especially against the list he ended up losing to.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we actually get a little bit of his lispiration just right here before he gives us some handy tips.
Really, though, I took a lot of inspiration from fellow Warhog Ryan Olsen's list he took the Renegade Open with, and workshop changes I made to his list. I wanted the Terex drill in particular instead of a drop pod, because I didn't want to have a loss condition, and the drill's super annoying to deal with. He was very helpful in gaming out what pregame options are useful in certain matchups. Having team to be able to be a sounding board is super important to get out of your own head.
Having team members is essential to getting out of your own head. Pete, doesn't that just ring true to you?
No, not at all. I really wish that I was a solo bird in this grand adventure sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep barking up that tree. Don't you worry, audience. And, Pete and I, as some listeners may have noticed by now, are actually, it's true, Canadians. And this last weekend, and although we haven't really touched on it, there was also another very large tournament that was a team event in Ottawa. We're going to cover it next week, the Canhammer Team Tournament. However, that one was dominated and decimated by a carload full of Americans, much like this Wheat City Open was dominated and decimated by an American bandit. So we asked Cyle if he might have some tips for other Americans looking to make that move north. In the grand tradition of T.J. Lanigan and basically every American who's ever come to a Canadian tournament, what tips he might have for beating Canadians.
Honestly, the Manitoba Canadians are basically Dakotans again, with royalty on their money and Tim Hortons on every corner. I treated this event like any other major I go to. Never look at the field beforehand, get practice games against armies that won't be there, and make very American-sounding, ego-driven claims of being ready to just take their trophies home the night before the event even starts, and complain the whole time about pairings being delayed because of some bug in PCP.
On the whole, Pete, that doesn't sound all that different from how you or I approach a tournament, so...
Yeah, I legitimately don't even do practice games.
I legitimately barely know what game we're even talking about. Why don't we bring this one home? Congrats, Cyle, on your win at the Wheat City Open in Brandon, Manitoba. And America, please, and UK, wherever you are, please, just do yourselves a favor. Google Street View, Highway 1, that's the Canadian highway that goes east-west in Canada. Just Google Street View the intersection for Brandon, Manitoba, and just go there with us someday. Yeah,
take a quick trip. Oh, and congratulations to Ryan Mandrick for not winning the event with the Leviathan list. You did your best, buddy.
I guess there's that hard counter. It's North Dakota.
Tournament news.
I'm Michael.
I'm Alex.
I'm Will.
And we're the High Lords of Terror. And you're listening to 40K Stats Center.
Alrighty, our very patient listening audience, it's time we bring this one home with a few quick hitters. Because yes, we have been off the air for quite an extended period of time, and there's been other stuff going on outside the LVO and some exciting things going on out there, including a GT in South Africa. That's right, the Cape Legacy GT happened back on January 25th in glorious South Africa and was won by Saki Basson, running Renegade Knights and a side of CSM. Now, the TO did reach out with some clips and some cool stories from the event, and we just didn't have as much time this week to cram it in. We're definitely going to get around to them, hopefully next week.
Yeah, because a big thing for us guys is to hit up these kind of out of the way tournaments that we just love to hear about from parts of the world that we don't get to talk about very often. Mm-hmm. Back to the quick hits. Last week, Lee Caselli parried all of those who happened to oppose him and took down the Cross Swords GT with some classic Night Spinner and Crimson Hunter Eldar.
David Hodgetts took Gravdev spam to the next level when his Iron Hands beat off his opponents at Over the Top in New Zealand.
And Ben Rubenstein cleaned house at Captain Con with a brigade full of Iron Hands good stuff.
All right, let's hit one last bump and wrap this puppy up.
Tournament news.
Hey guys, this is John Lennon,
Daniel Smith,
and Jimmy Prescott with Florida Man 40K
and Team Brohammer,
and you're listening to 40K Stats
Center. Well, Pete, I think that does it for our show. As always, hit that like button, subscribe, leave comments and reviews, tell your neighbors and your coworkers about how handsome and funny we are. And don't forget to listen to our compatriots on the Frontline Gaming Network.
This week, Pablo Scari, Salty John, and Steve Pampreen covered potential changes to the ITC for the 2020 season over on Chapter Tactics.
Reese will be doing some zany things on Signals from the Frontline.
And The Art of War posted their episode a day late when Nick Nonavati got stuck in Canada and John Damaris forgot he even ran a podcast at all. Luckily, this week, as mentioned, they talked with Eric Lathuris about just how his dirty neophyte list actually played out at CanCon.
You know, you'd think that they wouldn't screw things up. They could just pay people with all that Patreon money that they're getting with that paywall.
Oh yeah, the paywall. We should look into that.
You know, I've been thinking about putting you behind a paywall.
Oh, thanks.
Well, you're welcome. Not the reaction I was expecting, but that's fine. I'm glad that you're open to capitalist opportunities, and that's fantastic. And I think we've done enough end of show banter and we can roll those credits. Do you have anything left to say for yourself?
Bye-bye.
This has been 40K Stat Center, a presentation of the Frontline Gaming Podcast Network. Like what we do? Subscribe to and rate us on YouTube and wherever podcasts can be found. Join the conversation. Follow 40K Stat Center on Facebook. You can also support the show directly by joining the Chapter Tactics Patreon and competitive 40K in general via the ITC Patreon or by grabbing a subscription to BCP.